It's the perfect timing because our next guest is, in fact, on. You guys who watch Breakthrough News regularly will know him well. I'm talking about Brian Becker. He is the host of the Socialist Program, which you can both listen to as a podcast, but also watch on Breakthrough News. And we're going to be talking about the history and the present of NATO maneuvers in Eastern Europe. So, Brian Becker, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, I should say. Have you back on. And right now, as we get Eugene's mic situation figured out, we can just roll right into this story. Obviously, the last several weeks, there's been an insane level of just anti-Russia hysteria related to the issue of Ukraine. So why don't you jump right into it? Tell us what's going on and why we keep hearing in the news media that there's an impending Russian invasion coming of Ukraine.
Sure. I think the big news for this week is the discussions, the negotiations that are taking place in Geneva between the United States and Russia. And I have to say, sorry to say, here today on Thursday, there has been basically a breakdown in the negotiations. The Polish government is warning of the danger of war. The Russian government has also suggested that it's prepared to go all the way, that it's entering red line areas, non-negotiable areas. The Russian Foreign Ministry also just suggested or hinted that it might be willing to send military infrastructure to Venezuela and Cuba, obviously designed to create a counterweight, not simply in solidarity with Venezuela and Cuba, but to create a counterweight for what the Russians perceive to be the very profound encirclement of Russia using Ukraine as the pretext. And of course, as we know, large numbers of Russian troops have amassed inside of Russia, and perhaps as many as 100,000. The Russian government under Vladimir Putin has made it clear that they consider Ukraine's incorporation into NATO, or even the idea that it will be countenanced, to be a red line. Of course, Ukraine was the area through which Nazi Germany invaded the entire Soviet Union in June 1941. That's a profound fact that must be understood. The Soviets lost 27 million people. When the Germans, a principal part of NATO now, who are lecturing Russia about Ukraine, entered Ukraine, they liquidated the entire Jewish population. That was the biggest part of the early genocide against Jews in World War II, was the extermination of all the Jews in Ukraine. Some elements, pro-Western elements in Ukraine, fought alongside the Nazis. Some of their supporters, their legacy supporters, are now the ones who constitute the current Ukrainian government, which is applying for membership in NATO. So we're at a really dangerous moment. And I think because Russia, Ukraine, it's in the news all the time, people kind of are used to hearing about it. They don't think world war is on the agenda. There's kind of a diminution or a minimizing about what the real danger is. Ukraine, for our audience, was the second biggest republic in the Soviet Union. It was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The only part of the Soviet Union that was larger than Ukraine was Russia. So they were principal allies. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, the United States, through various agencies, including the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and others, pumped $5 billion into Ukraine in order to create Ukraine or bring Ukraine into an American sphere of influence. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, Michael Carpenter, who is the lead negotiator for the United States at these talks in Geneva, these talks that have now hit an impasse, said in his very hardline opening to the Russians, nothing will be allowed to violate our bedrock principles, right? Our bedrock principles. And what are those bedrock principles? We will have no tolerance for an overt or covert sphere of influence, meaning Ukraine cannot be a neutral or buffer state if the Ukrainian government, which was created by a US-supported coup d'etat, fascist-led coup d'etat in February 2014, if they desire to enter NATO, they will enter NATO. The irony here can't be more obvious. I mean, the United States has created its own sphere of influence, and it's called NATO. Mm-hmm. And NATO, at the time it was formed in 1949, was supposedly to prevent the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern and Central Europe from invading Western Europe. But it was the Soviets who 6 years later created their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. So there was a symmetry between the two camps. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Warsaw Pact also collapsed. There was no more Warsaw Pact. So NATO has consistently, since 1991, moved closer and closer to Russia, and has not only incorporated all the former socialist governments in Eastern and Central Europe into NATO, projecting it as a major threat to Russia, but in the Czech Republic, in Romania, and in Poland, the U.S. is setting up missile defense shields. At the same time, it canceled the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and then a few years ago, the intermediate nuclear range missile treaty, which before that treaty was established, the U.S. was putting missiles targeting Soviet political offices with a flight time of 6 minutes in all of the countries of Western Europe, meaning that there was a hair trigger for a new nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And that's what's happening right now. And I'll end with this, the American people are being diluted, are being deceived, or may and sometimes be the victims of self-deception when they think, when you put this historical context together, that it's the Russians who are somehow the aggressors by amassing troops within their own country. I mean, you can't have a more duplicitous presentation about this crisis. And again, Americans don't know what this means about Ukraine and Russia. For Russians and all Russians, they know exactly what it means, and they're not going to allow Ukraine to become a staging ground for the next war against their people.
You know, I think that is critically important context, Brian. And I mean, even just that last point you say there, for amassing troops inside of your own country. I mean, especially if you look at where the U.S. has troops all around the world. But I mean, even just this issue of Russia meddling in Western Europe and this being put out there in the same time that the U.S. is trying to block the Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Germany, sovereign deal between sovereign countries, Germany and Russia. The Germans say it's critical to their energy security. You know, people can certainly question that and what they want to talk about natural gas. But here it is, the United States, and I think the bill actually put forward by Ted Cruz did fail today, but there's a companion bill to more or less lay the groundwork for the same thing, that they're saying, well, Russia is meddling, while here is the United States trying to, tank one of the biggest infrastructure projects of what have alleged to be one of their most critical allies, that they claim to be one of their most critical infrastructure projects. I mean, it almost feels like we're just totally through the looking glass in terms of how these things are described and contextualized or not contextualized.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. The world is upside down in terms of propaganda presentation. We are through the looking glass. I mean, Germany wants to buy natural gas from Russia because it's closer and it's cheaper. And the U.S. says, no, you have to buy liquefied natural gas from us, even though we're, 10,000 miles away. And if you don't, we'll sanction you, our great partner, Germany. And so the U.S. has put all of this pressure on Europe. And the reason for it, I think, is not because, and this is important, I think it's not because, certainly not because Russia is planning to invade or interfere in Western Europe. It is concerned about what's happening in the eastern part of Ukraine, certainly. But the U.S. is afraid that unless it retains the discipline of the NATO alliance, whereby all of the European capitalist powers are subjugated in their own way, they're all enforced junior partners. Mm-hmm. They're friends with benefits, so to speak. They are part of the alliance, they are junior partners, they are friends, they get certain benefits, but they have to succumb to American dictates. That's been the quid pro quo since the end of World War II. And so what the U.S. is really afraid of is that Germany might become independent. Mm-hmm. France might become independent. The other countries of Europe that constitute the American sphere of influence would naturally seek to have good relations and trade relations with Russia. And that constitutes an existential threat, not to the people of those countries, but to the American empire's hegemonic designs that were in place after World War II. And I think that's really the issue. Why does NATO exist? It shouldn't exist. Russia has a military budget that's 1/10 the size of the US budget, and that doesn't include Britain and France, which are nuclear powers in or outside of NATO. None of these countries are threatened by Russia. Why does NATO exist? Because the Americans want NATO to exist. They want to use it like they did in Afghanistan. They want to use it when they want to go to war against independent sovereign governments, like they did in Yugoslavia when they dropped 28,000 bombs and missiles on Yugoslavia and destroyed the last remaining socialist government in Eastern and Central Europe. So NATO is a convenient tool for the exercise and projection of American power. And it also keeps Europe under the thumb of America, where I think the people of Europe, unlike their, capitulationist governments, would prefer to have good relations with Russia, good relations with China, of course, good relations with the United States as well. But again, they don't get a voice in this. This is between the US and its puppet regimes in Europe. Yes, they might be independent allies, but in one way, they're really proxies.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so happy, Brian, that you noted that about the European countries, because it is funny in many ways. Okay, funny is not the right word, but it is interesting how we often think of Europe as this independent place that's much like America. But it is, these are client states of the U.S. I mean, Germany is home to, I think, the largest U.S. military presence, if I'm not mistaken, one of the largest in the world.
Yeah.
That said, do you feel like as all this is happening and the seriousness of it is so important to point out, but you also hinted towards some of the maneuvers that Russia's made to push back in terms of their relationship with Cuba and Venezuela. And you also have this situation where there are many countries like Russia, like China, like Iran, like Venezuela, like Cuba, forming these relationships and partnerships that, might otherwise not exist if it wasn't for the fact that they all face bullying by the United States. But there does seem to be a level of pushback in this time that we're living in than maybe there was 10 or 20 years ago. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that. Are we entering a kind of new era where there's a sort of growing international sphere or group of countries that are capable of maybe asserting themselves in the face of U.S. aggression more than before?
Oh, definitely. I mean, China's policy 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago, was to appease the United States. And in large measure, so was Russia. I mean, both of them could have exercised a veto at the Security Council for the resolution that authorized the use of military force against Libya, and both abstained, right? They didn't want to poke the bear meaning America. They didn't want to poke the beast. They didn't want to have the war drive of American imperialism directed against them. So if it was against Libya, they probably felt bad about it, but better Libya than China or Russia. That policy of appeasement strengthened the neoconservative hand of American imperialism, accelerated its own aggression, and then when it turned out that China was not going to have regime change and that Putin allowed the Russian state to get back on its feet, and those two countries actually constituted a new, at first nascent alliance, but an alliance that's now fully consummated, that's both economic and military. And that alliance allowed, in a way, for the recreation of some of the symmetry that existed in the Cold War, where there were two camps. They were demarcated by ideology in the Cold War. It was the socialist camp led by the Soviet Union, and then the capitalist camp led by the United States. So there was an ideological component of the Cold War, which was very pronounced. But outside of the ideological element, there is the element of national interest. And to the extent that these major countries like China, like Russia, like Iran, which is also a very big country and has a lot of resources and has the ability to be a regional power, those countries are being thrust together and have acknowledged this sort of new relationship of forces based on the animus and hostility, the unrelenting hostility of American imperialism. And so in many ways, the rest of the world is happy about that, as it should be. I mean, some people say, well, we want multipolarity. I think that's sort of a superficial way to look at it. Multipolarity also led to 2 world wars. But what we have in a way is a bipolarity, meaning that there is a camp emerging with Russia and China at its center, and the United States on the other side. And so to the extent that some symmetry exists, it provides some space. You know, when Cuba was blockaded and sanctioned and embargoed in 1960-61, they could turn to the Soviet Union. But after the Soviet Union was dissolved, after the socialist camp was gone, that's when the regime of sanctions takes over global politics, because the US can wield the power of economic sanctions, which strangle a country absent an alternative trading bloc. And all of those countries then are brought to their knees. And if they're not, they're invaded or droned. And so the absence of an alternative camp to American imperialism meant that the people, especially in the third world, were completely subjugated to this dual regime of military threats and economic sanctions. So in one sense, the emergence of a new camp provides some potential breathing space for Cuba, for Venezuela, for Iran, for Zimbabwe, for other countries that have been targeted for overthrow by American imperialism.
You know, to what extent, I mean, because I think some people looking at this, I mean, I have to say even myself, and I follow these issues, I was a little surprised to see this flare up so quickly. And I think the points that you made there in terms of the U.S. desire to maintain hegemony at all cost are critical. And, you know, to what extent would you connect? Because I think for Americans, it's always sort of like, what's the connection of these international issues to our domestic issues? And of course, there are many. But to what extent do you think this extreme hostility of the United States against Russia, the encirclement of China, the promotion of regime change wars everywhere, is related to things like the fact that we can barely build a bridge or have clean water, and the sense that there's just almost like I think most Americans feel that there's almost like an epic collapse in, you know, quote unquote American greatness, and, you know, whatever the sort of the vicissitudes of that. I mean, is there I hate to, you know, be one of these people predicting something, but do you think there's some connection between, you know, quote unquote American decline and the extreme aggressiveness that we're seeing abroad?
Yeah, I do actually. And, you know, the U.S. sometimes said, well, we were a welfare state. Well, no, it's a warfare state. It is a warfare state. And it spends $1 trillion a year. That would mean $10 trillion over 10 years on defense. It'll be more than that. But when you have like a Build Back Better, it's called the $3.5 trillion, you know, thing for child tax credits. But that's over 10 years, which is minuscule compared to the Pentagon. But there's not even like a hue and cry about the Pentagon. Most of the Democrats, I mean, it's almost unanimous. There's a few sort of symbolic no votes on the defense authorization. But the entire Congress is an imperialist Congress, or almost the entire. I mean, maybe there's a little tiny fraction that's not. But they're not. They're just an appendage to the part that is. So, you know, we have a warfare state, and it's kind of not exact. Well, not exact at all, but there's elements like the Roman Empire where the military overextension and the primacy of militarism in the Roman Empire to conquer and maintain the colonies ultimately led to its own decay and degeneration. And here you have in the United States, you can't pass. I mean, here Joe Biden said yesterday, sort of heroically, he says, we're going to send millions of tests to 500 million tests to Americans for COVID. This is 2 years into the epidemic, like 2 years. During that time, the U.S. has spent $2 trillion on missiles and bombs and every kind of possible warfare. They're planning on how to militarily dominate outer space while 70,000 bridges are crumbling in the United States. And that number, by the way, is from the Engineers Association that takes care of bridges. I mean, what kind of system is it where the only sense of urgency and unity is for war? Because that's the reality of America. America can, you know, say we're wonderful, we're great, we're the best democracy, you know, it's the citadel of democracy in Congress. No, it's a militarized warfare state where the public treasury is being looted so that capitalist corporations can make guaranteed profits from this ever expanding defense budget. And what's it for? Well, ultimately, if it's for anything, it's for destruction. And so it's the only commodity in the world, the only commodity made in capitalist society that has actually no human use value. It may have use value according to Marx's capital and commodity production, but from the point of view of human utility, what can you do with a tank? What can you do with a missile or a bomb? I mean, these things are waste spending, and it's the dominant part of the federal budget.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Brian, because I think on a lot of these issues, it's so easy to feel, kind of hopeless and get a little nihilistic. Because it just seems like a system you can't change. Like it's this way, it's going to stay this way until the world is destroyed in the end. So everything you're saying is so important and it's also true, but then that brings us to the question of, okay, so what do we do? What do people do? Right? We're in a crisis pandemic situation right now where we're really seeing the horrible aspects of our system highlighted in a really extreme way, and that sort of like you're talking about where all the money goes to this destructive warfare state while we're left to fend for ourselves on like collapsing bridges. So what do we do about it?
That's the $64,000 question. And Rania, my intention was not to depress you.
No. I'm just thinking about
I wanted to, but I think it is the question, the one that you're posing actually, because, especially at moments where there aren't millions of people in the streets, the sense of despondency or, sort of hopelessness, it becomes very impactful on people's consciousness and also on their activity. If you really feel like a meteor is going to hit the earth and there's nothing you can do about it, you don't look up. And perhaps you look just for a beach to go to or something like that. But, if you think about the last 10 years, we had the Occupy movement change politics in America. It took off, and then it was suppressed. Then we had Black Lives Matter movement. It took off, and then it ebbed after a couple of years. Then we had the Bernie Sanders campaign where millions of young people in the capital of anti-communism said, yeah, I'm a socialist. And you had, all of these signs of movement, and then culminating with, after the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, 35 million Americans, Black and white and Latino and Asian American and Arab American and indigenous people together in the streets. And that went on for a couple months. But each of these movements comes and ebbs. And when it's happening, you feel strong. And when it ebbs, you feel like, how can change happen? Right. So the question for us as the left is to take the obvious desire for social change that keeps repeating itself over and over again, as I mentioned in the last 10 years, so many indicators of it, and building a movement that doesn't simply ebb and flow. And that is the issue of organization. I mean, the bottom line is, if you don't have organization, you start over again at every moment when the ebb starts again. If you have organization or organizations, because any really viable movement isn't just one group, it's got to be multiple organizations that work hopefully together, really together, in united front together. If you have organization, then the lessons learned from the last experience become really sort of instructive for how to do things better the next time. And so I think that we should be very hopeful. And I don't consider this an expression of what might be called toxic positivity. But I do think that there is a reason, a material basis for optimism, which is we keep seeing all of these movements for change. We see in Latin America, it looks like the right is winning and then the left comes back. I mean, but our goal for us, I mean, for me as a socialist, as a revolutionary, as an activist, as an organizer, with all of you and our audience, we have to strategically come together and build a movement that doesn't just go up and down, but that endures. And in my mind, that's having an organization, having political principles, having values that we believe in, building organic communities of resistance. And I actually believe we can do it, even though at this moment, it looks, as you put it, somewhat grim. But that can end also very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Brian Becker, host of the Socialist Program, fantastic show, if I might say so myself, which you can catch on video now here on Breakthrough News. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.